Picture this: a 38-year-old millennial and a 52-year-old Gen Xer walk into a therapist's office. The millennial immediately opens up about their attachment wounds, their nervous system dysregulation, and how Mercury retrograde may or may not be affecting their cortisol levels. The Gen Xer leans back, crosses their arms, and says, "I don't really do the feelings thing." And somewhere in that room, a very patient psychologist is thinking, "Okay, but which one of you is actually doing better?" That's the question we're here to unpack today. Not to pick a winner, not to trigger a generation war in the comments, though I know some of you are already warming up your keyboards, but to genuinely explore what mental strength actually means, where each generation got it from, and honestly, what we can all learn from the contrast. Because here's the thing most people get wrong. They assume that whoever talks about their mental health more must be mentally weaker, or they assume that whoever doesn't talk about it must be secretly falling apart. Both of those takes are wrong, and psychology has a lot to say about why. Let's start with where these two generations came from, because your emotional blueprint doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the world you grew up in. Gen X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, grew up in what researchers now casually call the latchkey era. These were the kids who came home to empty houses, microwaved their own dinners, and watched the evening news announce that the economy was in shambles while their parents were either working double shifts or processing a divorce that nobody talked about. There was no after-school emotional debrief. There was no, "How did that make you feel?" There was just, "Figure it out." And so they did. They figured it out, they moved on, and they developed what psychologists call a high tolerance for ambiguity and a deeply independent coping style. In plain English, they became incredibly good at surviving without asking for help. Millennials, born roughly between 1981 and 1996, grew up in a completely different emotional climate, more structured, more supervised, more validated. The self-esteem movement was in full swing. Participation trophies were being handed out like they were vitamins. And for the first time in history, children were being told that their feelings mattered, that they should express them, and that it was okay to not be okay. Add to that the internet, the 2008 financial crisis hitting right as they entered adulthood, a global pandemic during their prime working years, and you've got a generation that has been psychologically stress-tested in entirely new ways, and that has responded by developing an unusually high level of emotional vocabulary and self-awareness. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Because psychology doesn't actually define mental strength as the ability to suppress emotion. I know that feels counterintuitive, especially if you were raised in a culture that equated stoicism with toughness. But research, particularly the work done by Amy Morin, who literally wrote the book on mental strength, frames it as something far more nuanced. Mental strength, she argues, is about emotional regulation, not emotional elimination. It's about feeling hard things and still choosing your next move deliberately. And when you look at it that way, both generations have something genuinely impressive going on, and both generations have a blind spot. Gen X's blind spot, avoidance dressed up as resilience. There's a difference between being able to push through and being unwilling to process. Psychologists have a name for what happens when you spend decades not processing. It's called emotional suppression, and the research on it is genuinely sobering. A landmark study out of Harvard found that people who habitually suppress their emotions don't experience fewer negative feelings. They just lose access to the conscious experience of them, while their body quietly keeps the score. Elevated cortisol, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, a background hum of anxiety that they often can't name because they've never been given the language for it. Gen X isn't weaker for this, they were simply never handed the tools. They built incredible resilience without a manual, which is impressive, but resilience and unprocessed grief living in the same body is an exhausting combination. Millennials' blind spot, awareness without action. There's a concept in psychology called rumination. It's when you become so focused on analyzing your feelings that you actually deepen the wound instead of healing it. And while millennials have genuinely pioneered a cultural shift toward mental health openness that will benefit generations to come, there's a growing body of research suggesting that high emotional awareness without strong behavioral follow-through can tip into what some therapists call therapy speak without the therapy. You can know every cognitive distortion by name, you can identify your triggers with impressive precision, and still be doing the same thing you've always done. Awareness is the doorway, but it's not the room. So, who's mentally stronger? Let me offer you a reframe, because I think that's actually the wrong question. What we're really looking at is two different kinds of strength, forged in two different fires. Gen X developed what I'd call structural resilience, the ability to hold themselves together under pressure without external support. It's the kind of strength that keeps you functional during a crisis. It's stoic, it's self-reliant, it is genuinely impressive. Millennials, on the other hand, developed what I'd call relational and reflective resilience, the ability to name what's happening inside them, seek connection, and adapt their understanding of themselves in real time. It's the kind of strength that allows for repair, that allows for growth, that allows you to sit with someone else in their pain without immediately trying to fix it. And here's the beautiful irony. Each generation desperately needs what the other one naturally has. Gen X needs the millennial permission to feel without it meaning weakness, to understand that going to therapy isn't falling apart, it's the bravest maintenance you can do on the only mind you'll ever have. And millennials need the Gen X ability to act despite discomfort, to not wait until every feeling has been fully processed before taking a step forward, to understand that sometimes the healing doesn't happen before the doing, it happens because of it. Think of it this way. Gen X built a house with no windows. It's structurally sound, nothing gets in, but it's also dark in there, and they've forgotten what sunlight feels like. Millennials built a house with all windows and no walls. Everything is visible, everything is felt, but when the storm hits, there's nothing holding the structure up. The mentally strongest person, the one psychology would actually point to as thriving, lives in a house with good bones and open windows, structure and softness, strength and self-awareness, both. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. These generational patterns are real, but they are not destiny. Your brain, and I mean your specific brain, not your generation's brain, is neuroplastic. That's not a motivational poster, that's neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for emotional regulation and executive decision-making, continues to develop and adapt based on your experiences well into your 40s and beyond. What that means is that a Gen Xer who decides at 50 to actually sit with their feelings for the first time is not doing it too late. And a millennial who decides to stop analyzing and start acting isn't abandoning their emotional intelligence, they're completing it. The research on post-traumatic growth, and both of these generations have trauma worth naming, consistently shows that the people who come out genuinely stronger aren't the ones who suffered the least. They're the ones who integrated what happened to them, who took the experience, made meaning of it, and let it expand their capacity for both endurance and empathy. That integration, that ability to hold your history without being held hostage by it, that is what mental strength actually looks like at its highest expression. So here's what I want to leave you with, regardless of which generation you belong to or identify with. Stop asking who's stronger. Start asking what you're still carrying that was never yours to carry, and what strength you've built that you haven't given yourself credit for yet. Because you've survived your version of the world. That's not nothing. That's actually extraordinary. If this gave you something to think about, whether it's about yourself, the people in your life, or just the wild complexity of how humans learn to cope, drop it in the comments. Tell me which generation you are and whether this resonated. Tell me where you think I got it wrong. I genuinely read them and I genuinely want to know. And if you want to keep going deeper on how our past shapes the way we think, feel, and behave, there's a lot more on this channel that you're probably going to find worth your time. Take care of that mind. It's doing more for you than you realize.